Welcome to this presentation on Toxic and Destructive Leadership by Ashley Adams and Ayana Moore. Our focus for this presentation is not only to define toxic and destructive leadership, but to hone in on the impact and response. When you hear toxic or destructive leadership, what's the first thing you think about? Who do you think about? We all have had experiences with toxic leadership in various capacities throughout our lives and careers. Chances are you were able to specifically identify a leader that exhibits toxic or destructive leadership behaviors based on the readings. If not, you will likely be able to identify someone that falls into this category by the conclusion of this presentation. When toxic leadership behaviors are present, the negative impacts are felt within the organization and among the subordinate employee team. There comes a point in time when toxic leadership can become too overwhelming and action has to be taken. We will use this time to focus on the impacts and outcomes of toxic leadership. Toxic leadership was defined by Wilson as a combination of self-centered attitudes, motivations, and behaviors that have adverse effects on subordinates, the organization, and mission performance. On the other hand, destructive leadership behavior was defined by Shins and Schilling as a process in which, over a longer period of time, the activities, experiences, and/or relationships of an individual or the members of a group are repeatedly influenced by their supervisor in a way that is perceived as hostile and/or obstructive. In the article, Coaching the Toxic Leadership, Ketz DeVries outlines 4 toxic leadership pathologies and the best way to counsel these leaders to transform their leadership practices to be more productive. In a unique departure from traditional toxic leadership theory, the article highlights how narcissism, manic depression, passive-aggressive, and emotional disconnection behaviors are displayed in organizations. Usually, toxic leaders are regarded as angry or abusive, but Ketz DeVries highlights legitimate personality and mental health challenges that prevent toxic leaders from engaging positively with team members. This demonstrates to us that the toxic leadership takes on many different forms. If a leader displays toxic behavior that has adverse impacts on the organization or the employees, then the behavior is toxic. In their research, Shins and Schilling narrowed down destructive leadership behaviors to have 4 major impacts or outcomes. Each of the 4 concepts demonstrate the correlation between the subordinate employee, the leader, and the overall impact on the organization. Shins and Schilling's framework makes it clear that destructive leadership is definitely experienced in many ways throughout the organization. Some of the outcomes of destructive leadership behavior include resistance toward the leader, decreased job satisfaction, turnover, and increased stress for the subordinate employee. Destructive leadership has negative impacts on organizations on many levels. When destructive leadership behaviors are perceived or reported, they should be addressed immediately to avoid long-term damage to organizational profitability and success. As you think back to times when you've experienced toxic leadership, how exactly did it impact you and how did you respond? In order to research the effects of toxic leadership on individuals and coping mechanisms, Webster et al. Administered an electronic survey to a random group of 76 individuals who acknowledged having worked or currently working for a toxic leader. A definition of toxic leader was not provided in the survey. Instead, respondents were able to list what they perceived as toxic behavior. The most frequently mentioned behaviors of toxic leaders include manipulation, intimidation or bullying, abusive or emotionally volatile, narcissism, micromanagement, and passive aggressiveness. The respondents reported the negative impacts on their well-being, such as physical health issues, emotional harm, and psychological distress. Some physical health issues reported include illnesses such as colds or gastric issues, hair loss, headaches, or insomnia. Some emotional harm that was reported include mistrust, anger, and fear. And respondents also reported on psychological distress, which included self-doubt, stress, anxiety, and depression. Although individuals cope differently, there are frequent coping mechanisms, which include seeking social support, challenging or confronting the leader, taking a leave of absence, or even leaving the organization altogether. As destructive leadership negatively impacts individuals, organizations are therefore negatively impacted. The kind of impact on the organization often depends on what internal programs or reporting methods have been established and which coping mechanisms are used by the employees. In their research, Shins and Schilling discovered that negative attitudes toward organizations develop from followers of destructive leaders. These negative attitudes fostered a decrease in follower performance and lack of commitment due to feelings that their organization does not protect or support them. These kinds of attitudes and lack of commitment often leads to employee absenteeism or unwanted turnover, ultimately losing the organization money. As we have stated throughout this presentation, toxic and destructive leadership behaviors have detrimental impacts on the organization, peer leaders, and subordinate employees. In the same respect, all individuals in the organization each play a role in transforming toxic leadership. All leaders report to someone. In a situation where a leader is displaying toxic behavior, their manager has a responsibility to address the behavior through coaching, counseling, and recommending or requiring professional development opportunities to help the leader overcome their toxic or destructive leadership behavior. John Baldoni suggests that managers, especially toxic managers, miss things from time to time. It is the role of the subordinate employee to help the manager see the missing links. In the case of toxic leadership, it could be that the manager is creating an environment that is uncomfortable for the employee. Even if the manager does not take the advice of the employee has an obligation to coach up. The subordinate employee also has a responsibility to report behaviors that negatively impact their work and working environment. Employee assistance programs, codes of conduct, policies, and procedures, though encouraged, are often not enough. Instead, organizations should have trainings for those in leadership roles, equipping them with effective strategies to lead well. Additionally, employees need trainings for effective coping strategies when dealing with toxic leadership and to become aware of the different services offered. For this week's discussion, please use these guiding questions to help guide your initial post on the discussion board. What experiences have you had with toxic or destructive leadership? What role as a manager or subordinate employee did you play, and how did you address the behavior? Did you feel supported by senior leadership or the organization overall? Did you personally identify with any of the 4 pathologies of toxic leadership? Are you convicted to change your leadership behaviors that might be toxic or destructive? If so, what would you like to change? Thank you for joining us for this presentation, and we look forward to the discussion this week on the discussion board.